So hi, I'm an experimental psychologist, and I've been invited here to talk about my work on self-knowledge in decision-making. So I will present two of the studies we've done, and then I'll talk a little bit of what they might mean in general. So, right, let's start. So one of the main problems when studying self-knowledge is how to establish an independent measure of truth. That is, how can I know when people are right and when they're wrong about themselves? And I think we've all experienced this in our daily life. When someone we know well, they make a decision, and when they explain why they made that decision to you, you can sense that something is wrong. These can't be the real reasons for having made this choice, but you have no way of proving that to be the case. And they can be perfectly sincere and genuinely believe that these were the right reasons for making this choice, but to you it still feels like something is missing. And as it stands, in the nature of subjectivity, it is actually hard to ever prove that people are wrong about themselves. So this is what we tried to solve when we created our experiments. So we wanted a situation in which we would know from the outside when people are right and when they're wrong about themselves, even if people don't know this themselves. But tricking people about their own minds is a hard thing to do. So we turned to the professionals, the magicians. So they're experts at creating the illusion of a free choice. So when they say, pick a card, any card, the only thing you know is that your choice is no longer free. So we had a few fantastic brainstorming sessions with a group of Swedish magicians, and this is what came out of that meeting. So I'll now show you a brief movie. It's a little bit silly, admittedly, but it shows the experiments quite nicely. So it's still not on.
But there's another problem. These men have discovered that sometimes your brain appears to conspire against you, and no amount of scribbling can solve that. Petter Johansson is forcing people to make decisions.
This one.
It's a simple enough task for most people, and in fact, it isn't the real point of the experiment.
Why did you prefer that one?
Higher cheekbones, slightly better hair, not much between them.
Petter Johansson and Lars Hall have devised an experiment which calls into question many of our assumptions about how we make most of our everyday decisions.
We're interested to see what kind of detail the representations behind people's decisions and what kind of insight they have about those decisions.
Why did you choose this one?
It seems like he'd be someone with a very interesting personality.
Oh.
This is all quite boring until you look at the experiment from a different perspective.
We added a twist, a card trick, so that sometimes they choose one face but end up with the other one.
Watch carefully. The volunteer chooses the card on the left.
This one.
But Petter swaps the card and presents the photo that was seen on the right and was actually rejected.
It is a card trick, but it's a cheap card trick, based on something that the magicians just call black on black. So for each card, there's a hidden card behind it, which is actually the opposite one. Where we slide the other card over, the black card is hidden. And then Petter just uses his arm to slide it down into his lap.
I mean, it's two parts that's interesting here. First, the fact that they don't notice when you switch the pictures. It's interesting in itself, and it's quite surprising. And the second part is, of course, the verbal reports they give, that they actually motivate choices they didn't make.
80% of the people we tested had absolutely no idea that a switch had been made.
Again, this one just struck me. interesting shot. Since I'm a photographer, I like the way it's lit and looks.
It's a puzzling phenomenon.
Right.
This one.
Lars and Petter think that...
Right, so I can start talking myself perhaps instead. Right, so this is, so it's, first of all, so it's a quite robust phenomena, right? So very few people detect when you switch these pictures. And when you explain it afterwards, they often also refuse to believe that you had manipulated these choices. So the older man in the movie here, so he actually refused to believe it until we showed him the video of, okay, so you prefer this one, but you ended up with this one. That was the only reason he would believe that we actually manipulated his choices. So it's sort of, this is a strong effect. But what's more interesting is, okay, what happens, what do people say when they explain their choices? So here we've done a lot of analysis, looking at comparing what people say when they make a real choice or when they make a manipulated choice. And what we find is that they are surprisingly similar. So people will say things like, her appearance makes her look charming, a great character, or she looks very serious and she seems sympathetic and she has bigger eyes than the other one and a nice mouth too. And these are all when explaining choices they didn't make. And this graph here shows that we let independent raters rate all the reports for this emotionality, specificity, and so on, and they all look the same. And what's even more interesting is if we try then to match these reports to the actual faces, you might not see this because it's too small a font, but they will say things like this. So remember, in this case, so the participant preferred the woman, the face to the left, ended up with one to the right and says, so she's radiant. I would rather have approached her at the bar than the other one. I like earrings. And as you can see, she has earrings and the other one doesn't. So this must have been a made-up report. It cannot have been the real reasons. Right. So this was the first experiment. It shows that we suffer from choice blindness. And at times. So when we fail to detect that we don't receive what we get, we might end up constructing reasons for this being the choice without having any idea of that this is what we're doing. And the strong conclusion from this is, of course, that the fact that we don't find any differences when you talk about real choice and believed to have made choice is that we might make things up all the time. So we have done this kind of experiments for a large number of different choices, consumer choices, or taste and smell and touch. But what people want to know is, of course, so does it hold for more important choices, where we have more background knowledge and more sort of detailed and interesting things to say? So in order to meet this challenge, we did an experiment right before a Swedish general election. So this needs a little bit of background for the foreign visitors. So Sweden, like most European countries, the political climate is dominated by a left-wing and a right-wing coalition. And before each election, all the major media outlets, they construct what's known as a election compass. It's a set of questions that separates these two coalitions. Things like whether the tax on gasoline should be increased, or if it should be allowed to run major hospitals as private institutes. So in order to test political preferences and self-knowledge, we constructed our own election compass. And then we approached people in the streets of Malmö. First, we asked them to state their voting intention before the coming election. If they intended to vote left or right, then how strong that intention was. Then we asked them to fill in 12 of these questions. And here they would just rate to what extent do you agree with the statement that gasoline tax should be increased. Then we added a correction sheet which we would tally together the results. So this person would be 1, 2, 3, 4, something down to 9, going to the left coalition. So this person should vote for the left-wing coalition. And in this process, we also asked them to motivate and explain each of their statement, why they thought gasoline should be increased, the tax on gasoline should be increased, and so forth. But of course, there was also a trick involved, another collaboration with magicians. Let's see if this one works without... So here's another brief video explaining what happens. So we walked up to people and asked, okay, so do you want to participate? They stated their voting intention. And then they started to fill in the questionnaire. But while they were filling in, we were filling in an opposite, where we would mark down the opposite answer for each of them. Then we would hide this under the notepad. And when it was time to discuss, we would simply glue that one over their answers. Bam. So here we have changed all of their answers, or enough of their answers, to create an opposite profile, right? And then we would ask them, okay, so why do you think the tax on gasoline should be increased? We do the correction. We again ask them to discuss why they prefer the red green. And then the voting intention again at the end. So what we find here is, again, very few participants detect this manipulation. And the people that detect here, no one says, hang on, you manipulated my answer. They say, well, I must have misunderstood the question, or there is something wrong with them having done it, right? So they attribute it to themselves. But what we find is that there is so few people detecting that we managed to get 92% of the participants to accept that their profile had been switched from left to right, or from right to left. So what do people then say when we ask them to explain the ratings in the middle, right? So they say things like this. I might read this to you as well, right? So, and then we can take question 2. Large-scale governmental surveillance of email and internet traffic ought to be permissible as means to combat international crime and terrorism. So you agree to some extent with this statement, yes, that it should be allowed. So how did you reason here? Well, as it is so hard to get at international crime and terrorism, I think there should be those kinds of tools. And now the person remembers an argument from the newspaper. In the newspaper today, it said there can listen to mobile phones from prison, and if a gang leader tries to continue his crime from the inside, and I think it's madness that we have so little power that we can't stop those things when we actually have the possibility to do so. So remember that this person thought the opposite just a few minutes ago. And then there is a bit of back and forth at the end. But I don't like that they have access to everything I do, but I still think it's worth it in the long run. So if you've seen a statement like this, and not knowing that he was arguing for the opposite just a few minutes ago, there's nothing here that would indicate that this is not the genuine belief of this person. Right, so to finish up the study, so what happens then with the final voting intentions? How much do they influence themselves through this reasoning? So what we find is that 10% of the participants, they switched from having a clear intention to vote for the left to the right, or the other way around. We have 19% going from a certain intention down to being uncertain about their choice. And then a few going from being uncertain to clear voting intention. And these numbers, they're quite interesting in themselves, but you can then think about the polling institute before each election. They always say it's 5, 10 uncertain voters. These are the ones to target. These are the ones in play, right? But we show that, okay, if you can get people to engage in a conversation with themselves, they might be able to convince themselves, a lot more of them, going in that direction. Anyway. So what does it all mean, then, in 30 seconds? So first of all, the way I look at this is to think about it as, okay, so a lot of what we call self-knowledge is actually self-interpretation. So we observe our own actions, our own choices, and then we make an interpretation. When we ask, why did you do this? We interpret it the same way we would have interpreted other people. You create an answer that makes sense given that what happened. It's not that you look inside yourself and read off the real reasons. You construct a story that makes sense. And the sort of take-home message for you would be, okay, beware of the question why, both when you ask other people and when you ask that question to yourself, because what comes out is not always necessarily the right things, right? The other thing is that our preferences or our attitudes, they're often constructed in the moment of choice. They were not there beforehand to guide the choice. They actually created while you make up the reasons. And you're put in a situation where you have to express an attitude or make a choice. That's when the preference is constructed. It wasn't there beforehand. So that is another of the conclusions to draw. And yes, to sum it up, know that you don't know yourself. At least as not as well as you think you do. Right. Thanks.